can hold a permit. So that will be something that will probably lead to us having to redo the lottery because people who had a trust that was holding a property were previously precluded from being able to be in the lottery.
So he upheld the one rule, but another one can.
He upheld like pretty much everything else, our entire enforcement mechanism. The usufruct, I believe, was the one thing, and there was a timing issue on when permits can be issued that he also kind of overturned.
Okay.
But for the most part, the vast majority of the rules, and this is dozens upon dozens of rules that we passed as a council, he upheld all of those.
The operator residency requirement right now, and forgive me, I should have done more homework going into this, but do you have owner-occupied short-term rentals exclusively, or is...
No, so the requirement is not owner-occupied, it's that someone has to be on the premises. So it can be the owner, or it could be someone who's like a caretaker of the property. The goal behind that language, which Council President Moreno put in there, was to make it so that the problem you often run into with short-term rentals is someone will call because someone's too loud. And the person who's responsible for that short-term rental may be located, Mississippi. And so there's no person directly responsible for addressing that in a timely manner. So that was the language that was the original ordinance, was that owner-occupied or occupied by a representative of the owner.
Okay.
Who has a
But like in a duplex, like you're not gonna, like if I own a house and a group of fraternity guys come in, I'm not gonna stay in the house with them if they rent it. I don't understand.
For whole home rentals are prohibited in the city of New Orleans. You cannot rent out your house to a bunch of fraternity guys. You can rent out a portion of your house to the fraternity guys. For purposes of the way the ordinance was drafted, that's exactly the instance. If you have a bunch of fraternity guys in the house, there is someone on premises who's responsible for responding if something goes on with those fraternity guys. But to be clear, whole home rentals, the idea you can rent your house, your entire property to a person, that's already prohibited. We don't allow whole home rentals.
Right. So it's like a duplex, if the owner lives on one side or the caretaker lives on one side and you rent out the other side,
That would be okay.
That would be okay.
Because that would be the whole property, and there would be someone occupying part of the property. Now, it gets a little more complicated if your duplex has two different addresses. That could be complicated, but that's something safety and permits we have to make a judgment call on.
Enforcement, New Orleans Public Services is famously short-staffed. How do you guys follow through on this ruling?
Actually, before the ruling came in place, we actually have already fully funded the enforcement office. They had a pretty extensive effort before this was paused. We passed the original STR ordinance in March of last year. At that time, we fully funded and staffed up safety and permits to address that. They were actually doing a pretty significant job. They were sending cease and desist letters. They were pulling down illegal listings off Airbnb. They're actually fully staffed and ready to go. The problem that existed was that when the judge came in the fall and took up the case again to consider whether or not our enforcement mechanism was appropriate, he refused to clarify what he was pausing, and the city, in an abundance of caution, paused all enforcement. So since the judge took the case back up regarding the rules, all the rules have been paused since essentially August. So the reason why you see no enforcement is because the fully funded office we had in charge of enforcement was basically told don't enforce anything. Those same people are still there ready to enforce. And I would imagine over the coming days, as the city attorney's office goes through the judgment, they are immediately going to ramp back up enforcement.
When you search Airbnb, for example, in the city of New Orleans, there's maybe 10, 12 listed in the heart of the city. How do you find these actors who are acting outside the scope of this ordinance and enforce it beyond, them just simply saying, hey, I'm here?
Well, remember, when you list yourself on Airbnb, you have to have an address.
Right.
And the providers, the platforms, are required to transmit information to the city.
I'm saying, if you put yourself on Airbnb, of course you're announcing
right.
to the world. I'm talking about those actors who are not.
So you're saying the people who go on Craigslist. Well, typically the way we find the people who are not Airbnb is their neighbor calls the safety and permit office and says, my neighbor is listing an illegal short-term rental. So it is a lot harder to find someone who goes the Craigslist route, but I would argue many people don't go the Craigslist route because the reason why the platforms are so attractive is because both the end user and the person who's renting that unit have protections within the platform. If you rent out your property via Craigslist and the people set your property on fire or trash it, you don't have all the protections you'd have had you listed it through a platform. You don't require, for example, to disclose a credit card that they charge and hold against damages. So, I mean, you'll have people that I guess go to the dark web or the black market to rent their properties. That's kind of going to be something where if they're looking to find out worst case scenarios, that'll be the case. And when their neighbors report them for listing an illegal Airbnb, safety and permits will get them. It might take a little longer, but they'll get them eventually.
So what changes with this ruling? You said everything stays the same except two things.
First thing that changes with the ruling, we can now enforce the existing ordinance which was paused. So the first thing that will change is after the city attorney has thoroughly reviewed the ruling, he will advise safety and permits what parts of the law they can now enforce. Because obviously, with the usufruct language and the trust language, we're probably going to have to redo the lottery. But as far as how you list, what's listed, all the enforcement mechanisms they have to interact with the platforms, that all gets turned back on. Because right now it was turned off while the judge was considering it. So the first thing you're going to see is safety and permits start recording all the people that have listings done and start with those people. Because remember, in order to have a listing, you have to have a permit. Many of the people right now, while the enforcement was paused, are listing without a permit. And inherently, if you have no permit, it is automatically an illegal listing. There are some people who, through the course of this litigation, have maintained a permit despite the lottery and the cap per block. If you have a valid permit, that's going to be safety and permits call. My assumption is until we do a lottery, you might be able to still list if you had a previous permit that's current.
Okay.
I don't know. I can't give you a definitive answer on that because the city attorney and safety and permits are going to have to make that call.
And what's the second thing? Oh, I'm sorry.
But for those people who have never had a permit and have never listed legally, they are going to get immediate cease and desist orders, and they're immediately going to have to go through the entire process of safety and permits doing robust enforcement on them. And I would argue, if you look at the sheer number of listings currently on Airbnb, and you look at safety and permits as far as how many permits they have, it's 2 or 3 times at least more people being listed than permits exist. So I would say arguably between 50% to 150% of the permits that are out there are probably illegal listings currently. Those people will get taken down immediately because they have no standing or wherewithal to have a rental under any circumstance.
And what's the second thing that you said?
The second thing was the second thing that came out of the ruling, as I understand it, and we're still reviewing it as well, is that there was an issue with the timing of when permits are issued. That's something also the city attorney and city permits will have to work out how they're going to deal with that. But the big issue is, as far as going forward, because the trusts and the usufruct language where he said they're allowed to hold permits, we're probably going to have another lottery because those different groups did not solicit for permits or were not permitted to solicit for permits. They're going to have to get the opportunity to do so. So the big issue will be in the short term. If you don't have a permit, you never had a permit, you got to go down. And the safety of permits will be on that almost immediately.
And I'm just going to say on the usufruct, just to continue that, your grandaunt dies, leaves you a home, you're renting it out instead of selling it. Those people will now be able to apply for a permit, whereas before they couldn't.
Well, I think, this is my lawyer brain has to correct. If you have a wife who's married to a husband, and in the succession, the husband dies and leaves a usufruct saying you can use the house while you're alive, and the kids get the house fully. Previously, under that, a person with a usufruct could not hold the permit because they didn't have full ownership of the house, or maybe the permit was under the husband's name. In that limited instance, that weird kind of scenario, which happens not terribly often, but can happen, that person now has standing to do a permit. Even though they're not the owner, they have a usufruct over the property. For individuals that the trust situation, that's a bit more complicated. Generally speaking, people sometimes hold properties in trust that are kind of like future inheritance or secured property. Previously, we said trusts were not allowed in as well. Trusts are now allowed to do that, and trusts are very attractive to a lot of investors or families. Trusts will also be able to hold permits, according to my understanding of the judge's ruling. So because those two groups were previously prohibited from being in the lottery, it's likely we'll have to hold a new lottery so that those people can also apply for permits.
Makes sense.
What would you tell the folks who have, I've rented out my house for Jazz Fest. I already have somebody lined up for the Super Bowl or, any number of events that come through the city. They already have it on the books. What do you need to do in light of
If
this
you
ruling?
don't have a permit and you've never had a permit, one, I have zero sympathy for people who have been operating illegally this whole time and took the opportunity during the pause to operate illegally. For people who had older permits, who lined up to participate in the process before the judge started it, I would say for those people, you should go back through the process to try and obtain a legal permit. For those individuals who lose the lottery but are more than one on a block, there is an exception process that requires you to go to all your neighbors and get your neighbors to sign off saying, I can be the plus one on the block. If you know you're in that circumstance, then going into the lottery, you should be talking to your neighbors, talking to the people who live near you and saying, hey, I have an STR permit, I'm a good actor, would you support me getting an exception if I lose the lottery? There's a pathway for almost all legal operators in neighborhoods that are not overrun currently with STRs. Now, if you're someone who's the 5th residential STR on a square block, you have to go in the lottery and roll the dice.
Well,
And
yeah,
that's
it
that's
sounds
it.
like there are going to be a lot of reservations for a lot of tourists in the city that are now
That
left
is
in a gray area, left in
and
the lurch.
and to be candid, that's not our problem. There was a court hearing. There has been litigation going on this for almost 3 years at this point. There was a key hearing in August. All of this has been heavily publicized and covered by all of you. The fact the judge had our existing ordinance under review and the entire public was aware of it, choosing to book in New Orleans, knowing that this was pending, was a risk. If someone chose to rent, if someone chose to rent for Jazz Fest, I think that there's more than enough time to find a legitimate place to rent. If somebody was already doing Super Bowl rentals for next February, kudos to them for being on the grind. But like I said, this was out there. This was publicly hanging out there. If you decide to roll the dice to rent, knowing that the sword of Damocles was hanging over this entire short-term rental scheme, that's a risk you took, both as a person renting the property and as a party that was choosing to rent it. Now, generally speaking, you're not charged for your STR until you go into your STR. So really, for both parties, money, if you've gone through the platforms, really hasn't changed hands yet. So people will have an opportunity to go find another accommodation. If you have been on Craigslist renting properties the whole time and taking cash, that's a whole separate predicament. But if you're renting properties in a quasi-legal way through Craigslist, I don't have any sympathy for you there either.
So it's one per block, but with permission, there can be two
There
per block.
there is a process through which another individual, if they lose the lottery, can seek an exception. It is a very laid out process by Councilmember Freddie King, and it requires for all of the impacted neighbors to agree that you are a good actor and they want you to be able to do it.
Thank you for explaining. Now, the French Quarter, does that apply to the French Quarter?
French Quarter is a complete ban.
And
It
real quick,
has a
JP, I believe
complete-
that's 3 additional
Sorry,
exceptions?
3.
Oh,
I don't think it's 3 total. Maybe 2.
Or I'll have to double
Oh,
check.
We'll
so
do- we'll-
it could
we'll-
be 3 on a block with the, if they
With
pass all the
we'll get
exceptions.
the correct answer. It's
I'll pull it in.
Thank you,
Yeah.
Okay, and it's in French Quarter.
French
still
Quarter.
is
French Quarter.
complete ban.
French Quarter has always
Okay.
had a complete ban. The Lower Garden has a complete ban. My understanding of the ruling is that he did not rule on the existing bans, though the plaintiffs' counsel included them as part of our argument. He just ruled on the existing regulations, which did not address the fact that the French Quarter and the Lower Garden, I believe, were banned in 2016.
So
which
that's-
is old-
that
which is
ruling's
old.
to come?
No,
That's,
I don't know.
okay.
But currently, under the judge's ruling, he did not lift those bans. They are in place. You cannot rent residential STRs in the French Quarter. You cannot rent residential STRs in the Lower Garden District.
Let me ask you, just devil's advocate, I just got off the phone with a, agent owner, who says that there are so many people whose, and you know this, the
Right.
insurance has doubled, their property taxes have gone way up, and they literally can't afford, they're worried about being able to afford their homes, and they're worried if they don't have this income, they're gonna lose their homes. And I'm just wondering what your response is to those people. Let me back up. And this person said, we're the ones who are doing it right, who don't put the fraternity,
Right.
you know, in there, who are doing everything right just to try to make a buck and stay above water. So, and they feel like they're being penalized. What is your
My response to that is there's a reason why when we passed the final ordinance, we created the lottery system with an exception process to give people every possible opportunity to pursue an ability to legally operate a short-term rental for supplemental income. The problem we've had since short-term rentals came into the city of New Orleans is for every one person who's that, plucky person who's trying to make ends meet, there's a plethora of people that are investors who own swaths of residential property purely to create mini hotels and mini motels. You cannot regulate an entire city based upon how it impacts a smaller group of people. I think that when you look at the fact that it was a very kind of contentious process to pass the original ordinance, the fact that we have the exceptions, which were controversial, was an effort to let people who are doing everything right have every possible opportunity to do it. But there is no honest debate, no serious debate that short-term rentals have negatively impacted neighborhoods in the city of New Orleans. If you go through parts of the Marigny, for example, the Treme, two very historic neighborhoods of the city of New Orleans. You go to Bayou St. John area around the fairgrounds. There are communities where no one lives there. They're just houses that are short-term rentals. And the reality is that cities are meant to be lived in, not meant to be Disneyland. And we crafted ordinances, we crafted this process to protect neighborhoods, not to protect investors. So at the end of the day, there are going to be people who are negatively impacted by this. That's the nature of any regulation. When we say that, for example, people have to get a permit to sell cakes. If a person's been selling cakes illegally out the back of their house without a health inspection, it's going to negatively impact them to comply, but you can't risk health to make an exception. So we've tried to make the process as fair as possible to allow as many opportunities for people who are doing the right thing to have a fair shot, but neighborhoods come first.
Being a tourism city, do we have a higher number of those investors who were coming in short-term rentals per capita?
From my experience dealing with investors, the reason why our market was so attractive is because when you look at the cost of purchasing a property in New Orleans versus purchasing a property in a New York or a San Francisco, investors who have New York money can buy multiple houses with New York money where they might be able to buy an apartment in New York and vice versa. So our market became attractive because the tourism market that had a relatively low cost of buy-in. Now that being said, over the years, with the amount of property being bought to be Airbnb investment property, it has kind of created an artificial bubble where a lot of properties that were pretty reasonably valuated because you had local people with New Orleans money competing with investors from New York with New York money for the same property, a lot of people were getting priced out. Now, the cost of insurance is a real challenge. And it's something that everyone's going to have to deal with. We're all dealing with. And I appreciate that people have found this as a mechanism to make ends meet. And like I said, we've tried to create a path for those people to have a real opportunity to continue to do it if they're good actors, if they're neighbors, if the people that surround them believe they're a low impact on the neighborhood and they're people that need to do it.
So the question is, enforcement's been paused for the time being,
Right.
but now that we've had this ruling, do you have any insight as to how that will change? And whether we've been receiving complaints at all, whether it be like a backlog that people go into at all?
I can't speak to the backlog because I haven't spoken to the office about it. My understanding, haven't spoken to safety and permits, just tangentially, because this all happened today, is that enforcement's going to begin almost immediately. The city attorney is going to go through the judgment and see how it impacts our existing enforcement mechanisms, but I would suspect that if you're someone who has never held a permit at any time and you are currently listing, that you're probably toast, that you're probably going to get a cease and desist letter pretty shortly. And like you said, it'll be before French Quarter Fest, before Jazz Fest, for people who've been listing on the various platforms, there is no grandfather in that if you've booked a property through Airbnb 6 months out, somehow you can still list it. If you're in a legal Airbnb property that is listed and has rentals, and you don't fall within the groups that safety and permits and the city attorney have some legal standing while we redo a lottery, you're toast. So you might as well figure out ways to how you're going to deal with that.
How long does a permit last for? I'm sorry.
A permit, as I recall, this is purely from memory, is a year.
A year?
A
Okay, so
year.
every year you
There was a situation during this litigation, while we were in litigation, people who had permits going into it basically got to keep them. That's why it's kind of a gray area in that if you had a permit, a legal permit, it was in effect until the lottery kicked off. And the lottery was held in August. Because of the judge's ruling on the trust and usufruct, it's likely we're going to have to redo the lottery. So I don't know how safety and permits and the city attorney will interpret whether or not they're going to continue to allow the people who held legal permits to hold them through the new lottery, or whether they're going to shut everyone down and say you got to wait till the lottery. That's something that they'll have to determine because that's outside the scope of how we enforce. They enforce.
How soon do you think you could get the lottery? Because I mean, if people are hoping to get Jazz Fest, Quarter Fest, other things coming up. You got Essence Fest coming in the summer. I mean,
The safety and permits really had the entire lottery process down in August. I think it's really going to be based upon how quickly safety and permits can make sure those parties that were previously excluded the trust and usufruct, how quickly they can get them into the process and hold a new lottery. But as far as the process of the lottery, they already did it in August. So I don't think we're in March. Jazz Fest is in April. No, sorry, Jazz Fest April and May, and French Quarter Fest is end of March. So it really depends on how quickly safety and permits get the lottery up. And it also depends on whether safety and permits will allow those people who had legal permits up until the last lottery can continue to operate till the new lottery. That's what they're going to have to decide. I don't know what they're going to do with
And it
that.
won't matter if no home on your block fits into that category, the usufruct or the trust, because if you already have a permit and no other houses, all of the other houses are owned outright by their owner, then you wouldn't have to go through a
But for
lottery
those
again,
people,
right?
so under the previous ordinance, if you applied for a permit and in that permit application process, you were the only person on your block, you would be basically granted the permit. That was the way it worked. If there was one other person who applied at the same time, you both went in the lottery. The winner got the permit.
Is there any concern that you all are gonna move forward on this new lottery, move forward on enforcement? There's gonna be appeal, there might be a different decision, and then you have to stop it again, of the sort of start and stop of this particular.
Well, when you look at just the way the process works, typically, in order to pause enforcement pending an appeal, you'd have to put up a bond. The bond for the city's loss of revenue or loss of ability to enforce would probably be substantial. So I don't know whether the plaintiffs are going to appeal. It's likely they will. Depending on whether or not the judge chooses to pause enforcement while the appeal is pending, whether they make the case, what the judge's ruling will be, that's something we haven't seen yet. But until he does pause it, the assumption is it's enforceable now. So I can't speak to whether or not they're going to ask for an emergency appeal. I can't speak to whether the judge will grant it or whether the judge will require a bond. If he does, then that potentially could pause it. It's highly unlikely the appeals court would pause it at all. That decision to pause would probably be upon the trial court judge. So I don't know what he's going to do there. We'll see. But the entire time when we passed this original ordinance, we've known since we did it, it was going to be a complicated process and there would be stops and starts. The council and the administration together never backed off our commitment to fund the enforcement arm, which has been ready and willing to go. So whether they have to stop and start repeatedly, that's just what they'll have to do, because you can't just ignore what's going on in the city depending on kind of the whims of the legal system. So their job is to enforce. The judge has ruled in their favor. Until we get something from the judge pausing enforcement, our intention as a city is to immediately enforce.
Thank you.
All right?
Y'all all good?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Do you need anything else?